In this lecture, we will discuss how we can process arrays.
Whenever we're processing each element of an array, we usually want to use some kind of loop. Our preference is to use for loops. Can we use while loops? Yeah, we can do while loops, but it's a lot cleaner if we were to use for loops instead. Let me give you an example where let's suppose we create an array of strings, and for each element we want to ask the user to enter the name that would be stored at that element. So here's the code that would do that. So we have the array of strings, which we call name str, or I'm probably going to just say name strings. This is an array of 6 elements, and the reason why we know that is because the 5 in the parentheses tells us that 5 is the last index of the array. So then look at our for loop, and this is where things are really nice. We have index as our loop control variable, so we're declaring that as an integer, and we're just going to say from 0 to 5, which is the exact range of indices of the array. So what's nice about the for loop is because we can control the number of iterations, we can use the number of elements of the array, specifically the indices of the first and last elements, to specify how many times we're going to go through this loop. And that will allow us to do something with each element of the array. So what we're doing here in the body of the loop is we're going to assign the element at the specified index to be the result of an input box method. So remember, this is going to open a dialog box, and there's going to be a prompt there that tells the user to enter a name. The user types in something in the text box, click OK, and that string gets stored into the respective element. Here is another example. In this case, we have an array of integers, which we call squares. We're going to have 10 elements in here. And the idea with this is for each element at index, which here is going to be k, we're going to store the value k squared. So we see here that we can use, we declare k as an integer, and we go from 0 to 9, once again, because we know the first index is always 0, and the last index here is going to be 9. We can use that as the starting and ending point for our for loop. And then all we do here is say that squares k is going to store k squared. So for example, squares 0 is going to store 0, squares 1 is going to store 1, squares 2 would be 4, squares 3 would be 9, and so forth. Here is another example where we want to compute the salary for 1,000 employees. Trying to implement this code for each individual employee without arrays would be quite tedious. Imagine trying to do like 1,000 if statements. That would be a nightmare. So the array actually makes this a lot easier for us. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to have 3 different arrays. One array is going to contain all of the hours for each employee. Another array is going to contain all of the pay rates for each employee. And then we'll have a third array which would store the salaries for all the employees. And the way we'll make this work is a specific index would correspond to a specific employee for all 3 arrays. For example, if the index is 5, then hours 5, rates 5, and salary 5 all correspond to the same person. So then we have our for loop, which will handle each element of the array, because we see here that we're going to go from 0 to 999. And if you look at the code inside the for loop, it should look familiar. A couple lectures ago, we talked about how we can compute the hours. Given the hours and the rates, we can compute the salary, and we had to factor in whether or not there was overtime. This is the same code from before. It's just now we're putting it inside a for loop. That way we can compute this for each employee in all of our arrays. So notice that what we're doing is we'll take the corresponding element in the hours array and the rates array, multiply them together, and then that would give us our salary. Now this is if the hours is less than or equal to 40. Or if there is overtime, we can take the hours and subtract it by 40, and then we can apply the time and a half pay rates for those hours, and then also give the full pay for the 40 hours work times the rate for that employee. But we can see here that this will compute the salary for each employee in our arrays. We'll do one more example for now. In this case, what we're going to do is we will store names from a file. So remember before we were talking about how to read contents from a file. So the way we're going to do this is we'll first declare a variable k as an integer, and this is going to serve as an index for the array that we're going to use in a little bit. we're going to have SR object be our stream reader object. Now, we'll assume that this will be initialized to a new object of stream reader. Right now, we just have the variable. And then we have an array of names, 1,000 names to be exact. So this will be an array of strings that will store all the strings that are read from the file. Now here we'll assume that the file has 1,000 or less names in there. Otherwise, we could just use a different value for the size of the array. So what we're going to do here is notice we're not going to use a for loop in this case. And this is because we don't know the exact number of names in the file. So instead, we're going to use a do while loop to handle it. And notice the condition in this case. So we talked about some of these things before, but we haven't really used it until now. So remember, the peek method gives us a single character from the file without moving on in the file. And we said that if we're at the end of the file, this value would be -1. So this is checking to see if we're at the end of the file or not. So if it's not -1, that means there is still something to be read. So what we would do is we'll read the line in the file. So the next line, we have sr object.read line. We're going to take that result and store it in names k. And then to get to the next element of the array, inside the while loop, we'll increment the value of k. So that way the next name we read would be stored in names k plus 1. And then the next one would be in k plus 2 and so forth. But we'll just keep going through this loop until we get to the end of the file. And when that happens, all the names from the file has been read and stored in this array.